The desert wind carried a silence that was not empty, but heavy, like the pause between two heartbeats. Golden light spread across the sands, painting the cliffs and canyons in shades of fire and rust. Out there, far from the white clapboard houses of the frontier town, the land belonged to no man, and every man who dared to cross it. The earth itself seemed to breathe with stories of the old American West where survival was carved with courage, where hearts could be both hardened and undone in a single glance. And it was here, in this vast land of dust and spirit, that her life collided with his. She had fled the boundaries of her old world, a world that had judged her for her scars and whispered behind her back. To them she was ruined, marked a reminder of violence no one wished to remember. She had tried to bury the past beneath layers of silence. But the memory followed her into every town, every face that lingered too long. She had told herself she was strong enough to walk alone. Yet even in her silence, even with her guarded eyes, the loneliness pressed down harder than the sun at midday. He had been watching her before she noticed him, an Apache warrior whose presence seemed to rise out of the land itself. His hair, bound with leather, caught the desert wind. His chest bore the marks of battles fought, the strength of a man shaped by hunger, struggle, and loyalty to his people. There was nothing in him of the world she had left behind. He did not speak much, but when his dark eyes fixed on her, they stripped away every wall she had built. He did not ask about her past, nor did he flinch when his gaze fell on the ridges of her scars. To him, they were not ugliness. They were proof she had survived. Their paths had crossed when danger was closest. She had been cornered by a group of drifters along the trail, men whose laughter carried the taste of cruelty. Before they could act, the warrior had stepped forward, silent as the night, bow drawn with an arrow aimed steady. The men scattered like coyotes under a sudden storm. She remembered the sound of her breath when it was over, quick and sharp, and the way his hand extended, not forceful, not commanding, but as if offering her a choice. She had taken it. Days turned into nights, and still they found themselves walking the same paths. She tried to understand his world, the rhythms of his people, the way he spoke with the earth as if it were alive. He, in turn, seemed drawn to the weight she carried in her silence. She noticed how he never looked at her scars with pity, never with shame. Instead, when she caught his gaze, there was a fire, there a recognition of someone who had also walked through fire and remained standing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long over the desert, they stopped beside the cliffs. The air smelled of sage, sharp and clean after a rare rain. She could feel his nearness, the way his breath mingled with hers, steady and warm. Her heart beat louder than the sound of crickets beginning their song. She wanted to believe this moment was real, but fear pressed against her ribs. Fear that she was not enough, that no man could truly want the broken pieces of her. She turned away, clutching the thin fabric of her dress as if it could shield her from the truth she was about to speak. Her voice trembled, though she fought to keep it steady. "I am not enough to be your wife," she whispered, the words heavy as stones in her throat. The silence that followed seemed endless. When she dared to glance up, he was closer than before. The warrior's eyes held no confusion, no doubt. He reached for her hand and pulled it gently to his chest, pressing it against the beat of his heart. She could feel its strength beneath her palm, a steady drum that matched the rhythm of the earth. Then, without hesitation, he bent his head and kissed the scars that marked her skin. The gesture was not hurried, not careless. It was deliberate, reverent, as though he were honoring something sacred. Her breath caught. No one had ever touched her like that. No one had ever dared to see her wounds and meet them with tenderness. Tears burned her eyes, and for a moment she could not speak. The desert around them seemed to fall away until there was only him. Only the warmth of his lips against the places she had tried to hide. But the world was not so forgiving. She knew whispers would follow if they returned to town together. She knew the lines between his people and hers had been drawn in blood, sharpened by fear and distrust. What would come of this fragile bond if it were tested by those who would never understand? Her heart raced as she pulled back, torn between the weight of her fear and the pull of his embrace. The warrior's gaze did not waver. He had chosen her, scars and all. But could she choose him in a world that would fight to keep them apart? In the distance, thunder rumbled, though no storm could yet be seen on the horizon. The sound echoed across the desert floor like a warning or perhaps a promise. She lifted her face to his, caught between surrender and hesitation. Her lips parting as if to speak, and then the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves approaching. The moment broke, and her heart slammed with a new fear. Whoever rode toward them would not come without reason. She clutched his arm, searching his face for the answer he had not yet spoken. The desert held its breath, waiting. The sound of the hooves grew louder, rolling across the desert like distant thunder. She gripped his arm tighter, her pulse quickening as dust rose on the horizon. Whoever came carried purpose, and in this land, purpose often meant danger. The Apache warrior did not move at first. His eyes narrowed, fixed on the growing shadow that cut across the setting sun. He stood tall, his posture steady, as if the desert itself had prepared him for whatever rode their way. She envied his calm, even as fear gnawed at her chest. The riders came into view, their shapes sharpening against the amber sky. A group of men, their hats low, their rifles glinting faintly in the light. She recognized the posture, the swagger even from afar. These were no townsfolk out on some simple errand. They were drifters, the kind that circled places like wolves, feeding on weakness and fear. Her stomach turned. Memories of their laughter from that day on the trail burned fresh in her mind, and for a moment she could not breathe. She had thought they were gone, scattered by the warrior's arrow. But wolves rarely disappeared for good. The warrior placed his hand gently on hers, steady and warm, pulling her back into the present. He did not speak, but the message was clear: stand strong. His other hand rested on the bow slung across his shoulder, and though his movement was measured, she could sense the coil of readiness in him. Like a mountain lion before a leap, the men slowed their horses as they drew closer. Dust swirled around them, cloaking their faces until they stopped just a few paces away. The leader, a man with a weathered jaw and eyes that glimmered with cruel amusement, tipped his hat back. His smile was thin, more a threat than a greeting. "Well now," he drawled, his voice carrying over the stillness, "a lady and her companion. Didn't think we'd be seeing either of you again?" Her heart pounded so hard she thought they might hear it. The warrior said nothing, but his stance tightened, his gaze unwavering. The leader's eyes flickered to her scars, then back to the warrior. Quite a picture, isn't it? A broken dove and a savage. "Tell me, girl, is this the life you chose? Out here in the wild, hiding with him?" She wanted to shout at him, to demand he leave them in peace, but her voice locked in her throat. The warrior's hand brushed her arm again, grounding her, reminding her she was not alone. The men laughed among themselves, cruel and sharp, as if the desert itself joined in their mockery. But beneath the laughter lay something darker: hunger for power, control, for reminding others that fear still ruled these lands. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes fixed on her. "You think he can protect you? Men like him, they don't belong with women like you. They fight their wars, they vanish into the dust, and you'll be left alone again. Isn't that right?" Her breath caught, but before she could answer, the warrior stepped forward. His voice, deep and steady, cut through the air. "You will leave now." The simplicity of the words carried a weight that silenced even the laughter. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The desert wind stirred between them, filling the space with tension sharp enough to cut. Then, as quickly as they had come, the leader chuckled low, pulling back on the reins of his horse. "We'll be seeing you, girl," he said, his smile twisting as he turned away. The desert has a way of reminding folks where they truly belong. The men wheeled their horses, galloping back into the horizon, their laughter fading with the sound of pounding hooves. But the unease did not leave with them. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, her body trembling against the weight of unspoken fears. The warrior turned to her, his gaze softer now. He reached for her hand again, and though he said nothing, she understood. He would not abandon her. Yet the shadow of what had just happened lingered, stretching over the desert like the first hint of night. That night, as they sat by the fire near the cliffs, She could not shake the feeling of being watched. The flames flickered, painting their faces in shifting light. The warrior worked silently, sharpening an arrowhead with calm precision. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The warmth of the fire, no match for the chill that had settled deep inside her. Her thoughts wandered back to her past, the scars she carried not only on her skin but inside her heart. She remembered the night everything had changed, the night she had been marked by cruelty. She had begged the heavens for death, but instead she had been left to live with the shame others thrust upon her. People whispered, their pity sharp as blades, their stares lingering on what she could never hide. She had thought herself unworthy of love, unworthy of a future. And now, here was a man who looked at her scars, not with pity, but with reverence. Yet could such a fragile hope withstand the hatred of the world around them? She glanced at him, the firelight catching the strong lines of his face. He was not untouched by loss. The silence he carried spoke of battles fought, of people taken, of wounds too deep for words. He bore it differently, though. Where she had folded inward, he had risen taller, like the desert cliffs that endured every storm. She wondered what he saw in her, why he stayed when others would have turned away. The fire crackled, breaking the silence. She found her voice, quiet but steady. "They will come back." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once, as if acknowledging the truth she feared to admit. "Why me?" she whispered, her eyes searching his. "Why choose me when you could have any woman without scars, without all this?" He set down the arrowhead and leaned closer. His hand lifted to her face, tracing the edge of her scar with a touch so gentle it sent shivers through her. His voice was low, almost a murmur. "Because you endured. Because you live." Her throat tightened with emotion she could not name. Tears blurred her vision, though she tried to hold them back. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen her as more than her wounds. Yet the shadows pressed closer. She knew the drifters would not give up so easily, and beyond them lay an even greater divide, the deep line between his world and hers. A line neither of them had drawn, but one that ruled their every step. If she chose him, she would be turning her back on the safety of her people, stepping into a life where every day would be a fight. The flames flickered higher, throwing sparks into the night sky. The sound of an owl echoed through the canyon, a haunting cry that seemed to carry a warning. She shivered, pulling the shawl tighter around her. He reached for her hand once more, his grip firm, as if anchoring her to the earth itself. "We are stronger than fear," he said. His words lingered in the air, bold and certain. But as the fire burned low, and the desert stretched out in darkness around them, she could not silence the question that rose in her heart. Could love truly withstand the weight of the world? Far off in the distance, a flicker of light appeared on the horizons, faint yet undeniable. It was not the glow of stars, nor the reflection of the moon. It was fire, and where there was fire, there were men. Her breath caught again as she turned to the warrior, her voice barely a whisper. "They are coming." The desert night grew heavier. Filled with the promise of what lay ahead, the small light on the horizon moved with a patience that made her blood run cold. One flame became two, then a slow row of lanterns weaving between the low hills, like a snake that knew the dark by heart. The Apache warrior listened with his hand pressed to the ground. When he lifted his head, his voice was calm but firm. They were too many to face alone. They would move before the riders reached the canyon floor. They packed in silence. He tied the water skins to the saddle and strung his bow across his back. She smothered the fire and lifted her shawl. The night felt tight around them, not empty at all, but alive with things that watched and waited. When the first echo of laughter carried on the wind, he touched her shoulder and they slipped into the cut of the rocks. They moved like shadows along the canyon wall. He knew every switchback, every ledge sharp enough to slice a boot heel. She kept pace, breathing steady, surprised at the strength that rose in her legs when the need for it came. Behind them, the lights fanned out, searching. A shot cracked the night. Stones splintered near her feet and skittered down the slope. He turned, set an arrow, and sent it whistling into the dark. A man cursed. The lights slowed. They reached a narrow pass where the rock bent like the crook of an elbow. He lifted a flat stone and pulled free a bundle wrapped in buckskin. Inside lay a short rifle, a tin of rounds, and a bone-handled knife polished by years of use. He pushed the rifle into her hands and met her eyes. She nodded. She had not lifted a gun since the night her life broke apart. But her scarred fingers did not shake as much as she thought they would. The pass opened into a hidden bowl of land, soft with sage. He stopped and whistled, a sound so small she barely heard it. A moment later, 3 riders slipped from the dark. Apache men, quiet and watchful, their horses sure-footed as goats. They greeted the warrior like a brother and looked at her only once, their faces unreadable. The tallest spoke in their tongue. The warrior answered, then turned to her. They would take her to the village beyond the ridge. He would go back to Cut Sign and lead the drifters away. She reached for him, an urge born of fear and of something deeper, but he shook his head. He had to draw the danger off the trail. He promised to follow. His hand closed around hers, warm and strong, and for a heartbeat the world steadied. Then he was gone, a dark shape slipping toward the canyon like water poured into sand. She rode with the 3 men over the ridge and down into a valley of cottonwoods. The village rested near a curve of river that flashed like quicksilver under the moon. Fires burned low. Dogs lifted narrow faces and watched without sound. Women stepped from the shade of lodges and studied her with the kind of stillness that made every movement feel loud. She slid from the horse and stood straighter than she felt. A woman with silver threaded through her braids came forward. Her eyes held the clear bite of river water in winter. She spoke to the riders, then to her in halting words. You are under his protection. You will be fed. You will be safe. But safety here did not feel like the safety of wooden fences and church bells. It felt like the safety of deep stone, honest and unforgiving. They gave her a place near a small lodge. A girl brought a bowl of stew that tasted of corn and rabbit. When the girl noticed her scars, she did not look away. She nodded once, as if to say she understood more than she spoke, and left without a sound. The woman with silver braids sat across from her and tended a small fire. For a time, the older woman said nothing. Then she asked how the warrior had found her. She told as much as she could without letting the worst memories take root. The older woman listened with care. When she finished, the woman looked toward the river. He brings home storms, she said softly. He always has. Then she rose and left her with the warmth of the fire and the comfort of a woven blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and sage. Sleep did not come. The night moved on, and the village breathed as one living thing. From time to time, a horse shook its mane. A baby cried once and was soothed. She studied the lines of the lodge poles against the sky and tried to imagine a life here. The old American West had 100 stories about the Apache. None of them held this quiet, this care wrapped in discipline. She did not know if she could belong. But she could not imagine walking away from the man who had made space for her heart to breathe again. Near dawn, the warrior returned with dust on his shoulders and a cut on his arm. He went first to the older woman, who cleaned the wound with calm hands. When he reached her, he gave a short nod. The drifters had split. Some had followed false tracks toward the dry flats. The leader and 3 others had turned for town. The warrior believed they would not stop. They had a reason deeper than sport. He was right. By mid-morning, a messenger arrived from the trading post near the rail spur. The keeper had sent word. A rancher with many cattle and a smile thin as a knife had hired the drifters. He wanted water rights that cut across Apache land. He had a paper signed by a judge who had never seen the river. The townsfolk were spooked by talk of raids that had never happened. The rancher promised protection and jobs if the Apache were pushed back into the canyons. The keeper added one more thing. The drifter leader had been asking questions about a woman with scars who traveled with an Apache. He said she stole from him, and he intended to get her back. Her stomach turned to stone. She felt the old shame reach for her like a hand that would not let go. The warrior's jaw tightened. He asked the messenger for details about the leader. The description was plain. Same man, Same laugh. Same boots, with the silver spur that flashed when he turned in the saddle. The man who had hurt her now had coin and lawless friends. He had fire on his side and patience enough to wait for weak places. The village held a council. Men spoke with quiet fire. Women added sharp wisdom that cut through pride. The older woman with silver braids sat near the center. She asked where the rancher's cattle grazed and how many men rode with him. She asked what the treaty said and whether the agent at the fort would honor it. A young man answered with a bitterness she recognized. The agent changed with the wind. Paper protected no one when the wind blew from the rail yard. They chose a course not born of fear. Scouts would watch the canyons. Runners would warn families on the far ridge. The warrior would ride to town with two others to speak to the keeper and learn more about the rancher's plans. She asked to go. He refused at first. She set her jaw and named the truth. The drifter leader would move faster if he knew she was near. Better to be close to the danger they could see than hunted in the dark. The older woman watched them both, then gave a small nod. Let her choose, she said. She has already walked through fire. They rode out that afternoon. The valley fell behind them, green giving way to dun, earth, and thorn. The sun stood hard above the flats. The road to town cut straight as a blade, past dead cottonwoods and a dry well gnawed by wind. The frontier spread wide and empty, but the emptiness felt crowded with consequences. They spoke little. When they camped, he checked her rifle again and rewrapped his arm. She cleaned the cut with water from the canteen and tied a strip of cloth around it. He did not flinch. Late in the night, she woke to his whisper. Riders. They crouched behind a rise as four men moved along the road without lanterns. The leader's hat shape was a brand burned into her memory. The men rode past and did not see them, heading for the river bend that led to town. The warrior did not follow. He watched them vanish, then drew a map in the dust with a finger. He would take a side trail that reached the post from the south. She and one scout would cut north and watch the rail yard. The third rider would circle behind to keep their sign covered. He touched her cheek once, quick and steady, then melted into the dark. The town looked smaller as they crept in near dawn. The steeple cast a long finger over the roofs. The rail yard sat quiet, except for a lonely whistle from the far switch. She and the scout stabled the horses behind a burnt-out barn and slipped through alleys to the trading post. The keeper let them in through the back. He was a thin man with a careful face. He set coffee on the counter and kept glancing at the door. News came in short pieces. The rancher had met with the town council in the saloon. He had promised to put up a fence along the river and hire men to keep order. He claimed his men would discourage thieves and riders who came near by night. He left out that these so-called thieves were hungry families cutting small poles for cooking fires. He left out that his men were the same drifters who had chased her into the canyon. The scout went to find the warrior. She waited in the storeroom with the keeper. She studied the items on the shelves: flour, sugar, iron nails, a line of ribbons faded by dust, the kind that girls tied in their hair at church. It struck her how life in the old American West turned on small things like these. A sack of flour could feed a family for weeks or start a fight on a lean day. A crate of nails could build a fence or close a path to water that had always been free. Bootsteps thumped on the porch. Voices followed. She slipped behind a tall stack of grain and pressed her breath flat. The keeper walked out to the counter, his tone pleasant in that strained way of men who hope to live through morning. The door swung open. The leader came in with two men. He took off his hat and grinned at the keeper without humor. He asked for tobacco, salt, and a new coil of rope. His voice filled the small room like smoke. He talked about order and law while his men poked at the shelves. He said the rancher meant to host a barbecue to show goodwill. He said the council would sign a paper by week's end that would invite the rancher's men to patrol the river. Then he lowered his voice and asked if the keeper had seen a woman with scars. The keeper lied with more courage than she expected. He had not. He had heard she rode south. He heard she was sickly and weak. The leader laughed. Weak things break easy, he said. He set coins on the counter and leaned his elbows there. He looked toward the storeroom door without moving his head. She felt the hair rise at the back of her neck. He had a hunter's patience. His boots creaked as he stepped nearer. She read the scarred leather and the silver spur. The room spun for a moment. Before he reached the door, the bell rang at the saloon up the street. A man shouted that the rancher had arrived with a wagon full of beef. The leader snapped up his rope, tipped his hat, and strode out. The keeper stood for a long second, shaking, then let out a breath that seemed to drain years from his frame. He turned and found her in the shadows. He told her to go. The town was turning. She slipped out the back and circled to the alley. The scout emerged from the far end, tense but unhurt. The warrior stepped from behind the water trough, eyes dark with the knowledge he had gathered. The rancher meant to press the council that very night. Once the paper was signed, the drifters would wear tin stars handed out by men who had never listened to the river speak. With those stars, they would drive Apache hunters from the banks and seize the springs. And if anyone stood in the way, they would call it lawful. They needed proof of who the drifters were and what they had done. The keeper whispered about a ledger locked in the rancher's office at the livery square. A clerk had mentioned names and payments. If the ledger showed that the leader and his men were hired to stir trouble and blame the Apache, the council might yet pause. But the livery square was guarded by 2 ranch hands who enjoyed their job too much. They formed a plan that drew tight lines through town. The scout would start a small ruckus near the rail yard to pull one guard away. The keeper would spill a sack of beans on the livery steps and keep the other man busy swearing. The warrior would slip through the side window. She would wait near the alley to watch the back door and whistle once if anyone came. Simple plans never stayed simple, but they had no better choice. The afternoon dragged under a sky white with heat. Children ran through street dust, while mothers called them back from the wagons. The saloon rang with armchair promises and loud jokes about the barbecue. She stood in the sliver of shade behind the livery, palms damp against the wood. She tried not to think of the leader's boots or the sound his laugh left in her bones. The whistle came thin and sharp from the rail yard. One guard cursed and ran toward the noise. The keeper stumbled up the steps with a sack that split and sent beans popping in every direction. The second guard swung a boot and slipped. He shouted and bent to pick up the mess. A window latch clicked. The warrior slid inside like a shadow falling off a wall. Time slowed. She counted heartbeats and watched heat shimmer above the alley. A fly worried at her cheek. From inside came the faint rustle of paper. Then a hinge groaned. A door at the far end of the corridor began to open. She drew a breath and whistled once, sharp as a thorn. The warrior moved. The ledger flashed in his hand. Footsteps pounded. A voice barked from the saloon. The leader was returning. He and the warrior saw each other through the doorway. 2 men who had already chosen their ground long before this day. The leader's hand dropped toward his holster. The warrior vanished into the alley, but the leader did not rush. He smiled that thin smile and signaled to his men. Doors opened along the street. The town's easy talk went hard and quiet. They ran, cutting behind the blacksmith and into the maze of sheds near the stock pens. She followed the warrior through a gap in the fence. The scout met them at the far end with their horses already moving. Shots rang out, loud and close. Splinters flew from the fence post near her shoulder. She swung into the saddle and kicked hard. The horses stretched into the old rhythm of flight that had saved more lives than pride ever would. They made the ridge before dusk with the ledger tied under the warrior's shirt. The town burned smaller in the distance, at least in her mind, because something had changed there. Lines had been drawn she could no longer ignore. The old American West had 1,000 ways to pin a person in place, but love could take a knife to rope and cut clean. Whether the cut would save them or set the whole valley on fire, she did not know. The town shifted slowly after those days. The rancher moved his herds farther west, his power dulled without the fear he had once sown. The council listened more carefully, learning that survival in the old American West did not come from dividing people, but from understanding one another. It was not perfect. Prejudice still whispered in corners, greed still sought easy paths. But there was change, and change was enough to begin. For her, the greatest change was within. She no longer saw herself as ruined. Her scars were not marks of weakness, but of survival. Stories etched into her skin that spoke of endurance. Of nights survived, of mornings still claimed. She learned to laugh again, a sound so foreign at first it startled her. But in time it became as natural as breathing. The warrior's people welcomed her slowly, not all at once, but with steady acceptance. The older woman with silver braids became both guide and friend, teaching her the ways of the river, the stories of the stars, the songs of survival. Children who once stared at her scars began to sit beside her, asking for stories, and she found herself telling them not only of sorrow but of hope. Seasons turned. The river swelled with spring rains, and wildflowers bloomed across the valley floor. Life carried on, as it always had, but she carried it differently now. No longer as a burden, but as a gift. She had found love not because she had hidden her scars, but because someone had seen them and chosen her still. When the warrior asked her to share her life with him, it was not with grand words or promises, but with a simple question spoken beneath the stars. She answered not with doubt, but with certainty. For the first time in her life, she felt whole, and so, in a land where hardship was carved into every stone, where rivers were fought over and lives weighed against greed, their story became part of the fabric of the old American West. A story of love born not from perfection, but from survival. A story that whispered of courage, of scars kissed instead of hidden, of hearts choosing to endure together. Years later, when others would tell of battles fought and rivers defended, her name and his would not be written on papers or carved in stone. But the river would remember, the land would remember, and those who lived in its shadow would remember too. They would say that once in a time when the world seemed sharp with division, a scarred woman and an Apache warrior stood against fear and found strength in one. Another, the story would end not in silence, but in the steady rush of the river, carrying their love into every corner of the land, a reminder that even in the harshest places, tenderness could grow. And as she stood by the river one last time, the warrior's hand warm in hers, she knew the truth that had taken her so long to see. She had always been enough. Always. A thunder of hooves shook the ground. More riders poured in from the east, fresh reinforcements drawn by promises whispered in the saloon. The Apache line bent, but did not break. The warrior shouted orders, his voice cutting through the clash. Drawing men to hold the riverbank, she fired until the rifle grew hot in her hands. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, her throat raw from smoke. Yet she would not stop. Every shot was a defiance. Every breath a refusal to let fear decide her fate again. Then came a sound that chilled her deeper than the gunfire. A horn, low and steady, carried across the ridge. The rancher raised his arm, signaling his men. They shifted, pulling back as if the fight had ended. Confusion flickered through the valley. Was it over? Were they retreating? But the warrior's face darkened. He knew this was no retreat. It was a trap. A roar split the night as a wagon rolled into view, dragged by horses foaming with sweat. Barrels sat stacked in its bed, oil sloshing inside. One torch was all it would take to turn the valley into an inferno. The drifter leader rode beside it, laughter spilling from his throat as he swung a torch high. Her chest tightened. If the wagon reached the river, the flames would spread through the cottonwoods, choking the valley in fire. Families would burn before they could flee. Children would never see the dawn, the warrior shouted, rallying men to cut off the wagon, but the riders around it fired wildly, covering its path. Arrows flew, bullets cracked, but still the wagon barreled forward. She raised her rifle, her breath sharp. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady her aim on the torch in the leader's hand. The memory of his laugh pressed in, his eyes, his cruelty. She forced herself to breathe slower, to see not the past, but the flame that threatened everything. The older woman's voice rose again, louder, fiercer, carried by the drums. The people shouted with her, their cries filling the night with defiance. Yet the wagon thundered closer. Every wheel a promise of destruction. The warrior broke into a run, arrows flying from his bow as fast as his hands could move. One struck a rider, another split the wagon's side, oil spilling onto the dirt, but the torch still burned in the leader's hand. Fire dancing dangerously close to the barrels. She pulled the trigger, the shot ringing clear. The torch spun from his grip, flames scattering harmlessly in the dirt. He cursed, fury twisting his face, his eyes locking on hers across the battlefield. This was no longer about land or water. This was personal, old scars meeting new. He wheeled his horse, drawing his pistol, and charged straight toward her. The rancher shouted, trying to pull him back, but the leader did not listen. His rage was a storm now, and she was its target. The warrior turned, saw the charge, and sprinted to intercept. But the distance was wide, and the leader's horse was fast. She braced the rifle again, her heart pounding louder than the drums. The silver spur glinted as he closed in, his pistol raised. The valley roared around them, shouts, drums, fire, the clash of steel and wood butt for her. Everything narrowed to that single moment. The man who had broken her past bore down on her with fury in his eyes. And the man who had saved her heart raced to meet him. The distance closed. The leader's pistol rose. The warrior's arrow flew. She pulled the trigger once more. The clash of fate was seconds away. The shot. The arrow and the roar of the horse collided in the same heartbeat. Smoke stung her eyes, but she saw enough to know that the moment she had feared, the moment she had run from all her life, was finally upon her. The drifter leader jerked in the saddle, fury twisting his features even as the arrow pierced his shoulder. Her bullet struck true, grazing his arm and spinning the pistol from his grip. He let out a scream, more rage than pain, as his horse reared violently beneath him. The silver spur flashed one last time in the firelight before he tumbled hard to the ground. The battlefield seemed to pause around him. The wagon wobbled and stopped, its horses screaming as Apache arrows found their marks. Oil leaked into the dirt but caught no flame. The leader staggered to his feet, clutching his wound, his eyes burning with hatred as they found her. He spat a curse, reaching for the knife at his belt, but the warrior was already there. With speed and strength born of countless battles, he slammed into the man, knocking him backward. The knife clattered to the ground. The two men fought in the dirt, fists and fury mixing with the dust of the valley floor. She could not breathe, every blow echoing inside her chest. She wanted to run to him, to help, but she knew this fight was theirs. The warrior's eyes never wavered, his strikes fueled not by vengeance but by purpose. The leader lashed out with desperate rage, trying to claw back the control slipping through his fingers. Their struggle drew the gaze of every rider, every villager, every child watching from the lodges. It was more than two men. It was every scar, every betrayal, every injustice brought to a single reckoning. When the leader finally fell still, pinned and beaten, his fury drained into the dust. The warrior stood over him, chest heaving, but he did not strike the final blow. He looked at her instead. The choice was hers. She stepped forward, rifle heavy in her hands, her scars burning in the firelight. For years she had lived under the weight of this man's cruelty, his laughter haunting her nights. Now, with the valley watching, she let the rifle fall to her side. She did not need to end him to reclaim herself. Survival was her victory, and choosing life was her defiance. The warrior understood. He bound the leader's hands with rawhide and pulled him to his knees. The battle's noise dimmed around them, as if the land itself exhaled. The rancher tried to turn his horse to flee into the hills, but Apache riders closed in. His bravado cracked as they surrounded him, his promises of gold falling flat in the smoke-filled air. The older woman stepped forward, her staff steady in her hand, and told him in a voice like stone that the river was not for sale. His cattle would not drink from its waters, nor would his men cross its banks. He was sent away in shame, his empire of paper crumbling before the power of people who refused to bend. The drifter leader and the last of his men were marched to town the next day. The ledger carried proof of their treachery, every coin counted, every cruel deed recorded. Faced with the truth, the council could not ignore the lies they had believed. The judge's paper, the rancher's promises, the drifter's threats, it all burned beneath the weight of evidence. Some men hung their heads, ashamed. Others looked away, unwilling to admit how close they had come to selling their souls for comfort. The leader's laughter was gone, his voice broken into silence. For her, the return to town was not easy. Faces turned toward her as they always had, eyes lingering on her scars. Yet something had changed. Where once she had lowered her gaze, now she met their stares with steady strength. The warrior walked at her side, and in his presence she felt no need to hide. She had fought, she had endured, and she had chosen life. No whisper could undo that. Back in the valley, peace did not return all at once. Families rebuilt lodges, children carried water to douse the last embers. Men patrolled the ridges to guard against what might come again. The scars of fire lingered on the cottonwoods, but new shoots of green pressed through the ash, stubborn and alive. She often sat by the river, listening to its song, a reminder that life always moved forward. The warrior joined her there, quiet as the flow itself. He rarely spoke of victory, for to him battles were never truly won. They were endured like storms, leaving behind both ruin and growth. But when his hand found hers, steady and sure, she felt the kind of peace she had thought was lost to her forever. One evening, as the sky turned red and gold above the cliffs, she whispered again the words that had once nearly broken her. "I am not enough to be your wife." Her voice trembled, though not with fear. But with the weight of memory, the warrior turned to her, his gaze steady, his hand lifting to trace the lines of her scars as he had before. His voice was quiet, but it carried the strength of the earth beneath them. "You are more than enough. You are fire that refuses to be quenched." Then he kissed her scars again, not as wounds, but as proof of her courage. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not born of sorrow. They were release washing away years of shame. She leaned into him, letting the warmth of his embrace sink into the deepest places of her heart. Around them, the desert stretched vast and endless, but she no longer felt small within it. Together, they were part of its story, as enduring as stone and as fluid as the river. They reached the valley as the first stars pricked the sky. The older woman listened to the story and took the ledger with careful hands. She sent a runner for a man who could read the English script and another for a young warrior who knew the treaty from memory. The council gathered again, faces lit by fire, by fear, by grit. Names appeared in the ledger, payments, dates, a list of chores that were no chores at all, but acts meant to push one people against another. It was not enough to win, and it was enough to slow the tide. If they could move fast, the warrior would ride before dawn to meet an old friend who served with the scouts at the fort, a man who owed him a favor and respected the truth even when it cut. She would go to the river bend with the older woman and speak with families ready to move higher into the hills. The scout would watch the passes. They ate a small meal and said little more. A wind rose, sharp with the smell of rain that might not come. She looked at the warrior across the fire. His scars glowed like bronze. His eyes held a question he did not speak. She felt the answer settle in her chest, heavy and sure. She would not run from this. She would not let the man who hurt her decide the shape of her days. Then the dogs lifted their heads at once. Rider broke from the dark at a dead run, horse lathered, breath ragged. He slid from the saddle in a spray of dust and pointed toward the northern ridge. "Torches," he said. "Many." The rancher's brand carried high. The drifter leader rode at the front, silver spur catching firelight with each step of his horse. The older woman stood and called for the war drums. The sound rolled out of the valley and up the sides of the hills until the stars seemed to tremble. The warrior took up his bow. She reached for the rifle without waiting for fear to call her back. The council split to their tasks with the swift order born of long practice. At the edge of the village she paused, the rifle warm in her hands. The drums beat steady, a heartbeat for the valley. She looked at the ridge and saw the line of flames moving like a slow river. Somewhere in that line was the man who had marked her. Somewhere in that line was a choice that would cost more than words. The warrior stepped beside her and touched his forehead to hers for a brief breath. No promise, no plan that could tame what came next. Only this, only the truth they had chosen. The first torch lifted high. A voice called down from the ridge with a demand and a time limit that could not be met without breaking the river in two. The dogs whined. The children gathered close to their mothers. The drums held the night steady, while the flame answered with bright, rough laughter. She raised the rifle and found the leader through the wavering heat. He lifted his hand as if greeting an old friend. The rancher's men spread wide to flank the creek. The older woman lifted her staff. The warrior notched an arrow. The ridge flared brighter, and a single shot snapped the air. The single shot cracked the night wide open. For a breath, the desert held still, every sound swallowed by the echo. Then chaos broke. Torches waved like restless fireflies across the ridge, and shouts carried down into the valley. Horses screamed, hooves hammered, the air filled with a sharp scent of smoke as the rancher's men pressed forward. She steadied, her rifle against her shoulder, her cheek pressed hard to the wood. The warrior crouched beside her, an arrow drawn, his gaze steady on the line of advancing riders. The war drums thundered like a heartbeat, faster now, urging courage through the valley. Women pulled children into lodges, men gathered near the riverbank with bows and rifles, their faces lit by the glow of fire. The older woman lifted her staff high, her silver-threaded braids catching the light, her voice rising in words that carried power even if she did not know their meaning. The leader rode at the front, hat pulled low, silver spur flashing in the light. His grin shone faint and cruel, even from this distance. She felt her stomach twist at the sight of him, memories clawing their way back with every step his horse took. The rancher rode a few paces behind, heavy and certain. A man who thought money and paper gave him claim to rivers and lives alike. Together, they looked like men who had already decided the outcome, certain of their control. The warrior touched her arm. His eyes found hers for the briefest moment, speaking without sound. She was not alone. Her scars were not chains anymore. They were weapons, as sharp as any blade. The rancher's men spread wide, their torches casting long fingers of light that made the valley seem smaller than it was. The drifter leader barked orders, his voice rising above the drums. He shouted, about land, about law, about how the river belonged to the rancher now. His words dripped poison into the night. But they were meant to rattle the hearts of those who listened. The warrior answered with silence. He raised his bow, and the others followed. Dozens of arrows lifted as one, their tips glinting like stars. She raised her rifle, her breath steady. The tension pulled tighter, like a rope stretched to breaking. Then came a sudden roar of hooves. The rancher's men pushed forward, torches high, trying to force the Apache back with sheer fear. Arrows loosed into the dark, finding marks with deadly precision. A torch fell and hissed out in the dirt. Horses bucked. Shouts turned to cries of anger. The air filled with smoke, firelight, and the hiss of arrows. She fired once, the recoil jarring her shoulder. A rider fell, his torch tumbling into the grass. The warrior's arrow split another torch, scattering embers before they could set flame to the dry brush. The ridge glowed brighter as more riders pressed forward, their numbers like a dark tide that threatened to drown the valley. The older woman shouted again, her voice rising above the clash. The war drums matched her call, rolling louder, deeper, unbroken. The sound carried strength into every heart within the valley, binding them together, but the enemy was relentless. Shots cracked from rifles, bullets slicing the air. A lodge pole splintered near the fire. A young man stumbled with a cry, his bow dropping from his hand. She ran to him, dragging him behind cover, pressing her hand to the wound in his shoulder. Blood slicked her fingers, hot and fast. The boy gritted his teeth, trying not to cry out. She tied a strip of cloth tight, whispering words she had not spoken to anyone in years. Words of comfort she barely believed. When she looked up, the warrior was still on his feet, still firing. His focus unbroken, even as bullets cut the air around him. The drifter leader rode closer, pistol raised. His laugh cut across the noise, sharp and familiar, pulling her deeper into memory. She froze for a moment, the sound dragging her back to the night she had lost everything. She felt herself shrinking, breath shallow, heart hammering. Then the warrior's voice reached her, calling her name with a steadiness that snapped her back to the present. She lifted her rifle again, her body trembling but her aim steady. The The leader's eyes found hers through the smoke. Recognition lit them, followed by a cruel satisfaction. He tipped his hat in mockery before firing his pistol toward her. The shot split the air, striking the dirt inches from her feet. Rage flared through her, burning hotter than fear. She fired back, the bullet sparking against his stirrup and forcing him to jerk his horse aside. His grin faltered for the first time, twisting into a snarl. The clash grew heavier. The rancher's men circled, trying to push into the heart of the valley, while the Apache held firm along the river. Flames lit the cottonwoods, sparks rising into the night sky like wild stars. Smoke stung her eyes, but she would not look away. She saw the warrior moving like the wind itself, every arrow precise, every step sure, not just for land, but for her, for the life they might claim if they could survive this storm. Still, the enemy pressed harder. The rancher bellowed promises of gold and land, trying to pull wavering townsfolk to his side. Some men from town had already joined his ranks, lured by the weight of coin, their faces twisted with uncertainty, yet their rifles spoke with deadly certainty. The older woman moved through the chaos like a flame untouchable by wind. She pulled children to safety, shouted commands, and struck at riders with her staff when they drew too near. Her voice carried power, a reminder that this fight was not only about land or water, but about dignity, about refusing to bow to the weight of greed,